The year was 338 BC, and across the blood-soaked plains of the central states, the stench of death hung heavy in the autumn air like a funeral shroud that refused to lift. This was China during the Warring States period, an era when 7 great kingdoms clawed at each other's throats with a savagery that would make wild beasts recoil in horror, and the very notion of a unified, peaceful empire seemed as distant and impossible as the stars themselves. The battlefields were graveyards of ambition, littered with the broken bodies of soldiers who had died for causes they barely understood, serving lords who viewed them as nothing more than expendable pieces in an endless game of conquest and survival. But what the cultured nobles of Wei, Zhao, and Chu could not have imagined was that in the supposedly backward western kingdom of Qin, a revolution was being born that would transform not just China, but the very nature of governance itself. The architect of this transformation was already dead by 338 BC, his body torn apart by 5 chariots in the most horrific execution imaginable, but his ideas lived on like a virus in the bloodstream of the state, reshaping everything they touched with a precision that would have terrified their creator. Of these 7 warring kingdoms, Qin stood apart not for its military might or cultural sophistication, but for its profound, almost pathetic weakness. This was a land of rugged mountains and untamed frontiers, where the harsh landscape seemed to mirror the brutal lives of its inhabitants, and where the refined arts of poetry and philosophy that flourished in the eastern courts were viewed as foreign luxuries that served no practical purpose. Its capital was a provincial backwater where the streets ran with mud rather than the fine paving stones of more prosperous cities, and its military was a joke, a collection of poorly equipped farmers who fled at the first sight of real soldiers. Into this world of chaos and decay had come a man whose mind burned with ideas so radical, so completely alien to everything the ancient world understood about power and governance, that he seemed to belong to a different species entirely. His name was Shang Yang, and he was a minor nobleman from the rival state of Wei, a man who had been driven from his homeland not by military defeat or political scandal, but by the far more dangerous crime of thinking thoughts that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which civilized society rested. Where other scholars saw the eternal struggle between virtue and vice, Shang Yang perceived something far more terrifying, a universe governed not by moral principles or divine mandate, but by the cold, mechanical laws of cause and effect. To him, human beings were not creatures blessed with immortal souls, but animals whose behavior could be predicted, controlled, and manipulated through the systematic application of rewards and punishments. This was not philosophy, but engineering, an attempt to transform the messy business of governing humans into something as precise as the movement of the stars. His journey to Qin had been a pilgrimage of desperate ambition, the last gamble of a man who understood that his revolutionary ideas would either transform the world or destroy him completely. He arrived as one scholar among many, attracted by Duke Xiao's increasingly frantic search for anyone who might possess the secret to saving his dying kingdom. The Duke, a man whose pride had been ground down by years of military defeats, had issued a desperate plea to all corners of the known world for talent, for anyone who could reverse Qin's seemingly inevitable slide toward extinction. But where other advisors saw an opportunity for personal advancement, Shang Yang saw something far grander and more dangerous, a chance to conduct the ultimate experiment in human governance, to test his theories not in academic debate, but in the brutal laboratory of political reality. His first audiences with Duke Xiao were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, carefully crafted performances designed to prepare the ruler's mind for ideas that would have seemed monstrous to any conventional thinker. In their initial meeting, Shang Yang spoke eloquently of gradual moral reform that would slowly elevate Qin to respectability among civilized kingdoms. Duke Xiao's reaction was predictable. polite boredom followed by dismissal. Their second encounter saw Shang Yang advocate for benevolent leadership and cultural refinement. Again, disappointment. The Duke had not summoned scholars to hear recycled platitudes about virtue. His kingdom was dying, his enemies gathering like vultures, and he needed solutions that matched his desperate urgency. It was in their third meeting, conducted in the private chambers with only the two men present, that Shang Yang finally revealed his true nature. He spoke of the way of the hegemon, and as the words left his mouth, the very air seemed to change. Charged with ideas so radical, they threatened to shatter everything both men believed about power and governance. This was not reform, but revolution, the complete destruction of existing systems. Shang Yang described a world where birth meant nothing and merit everything, where ancient aristocratic privileges would be swept away like debris before a flood, and where every aspect of human behavior would be controlled by laws so precise and unforgiving that they would transform governance into mathematical certainty. As Shang Yang spoke, his voice never rising above conversational tone but his eyes burning with the fervor of a man who had glimpsed the future, Duke Xiao felt something he had not experienced in years: hope. Not desperate hope, but the cold, calculating hope of someone who suddenly understood that salvation was possible, even if the price would be higher than anything imaginable. The conversation stretched through the night, the two men locked in a dialogue that would reshape not just Qin, but all of China. The bargain they struck was simple in terms, but staggering in implications. Duke Xiao would grant Shang Yang unprecedented authority to remake Qin according to his vision, while Shang Yang would provide the iron-willed execution necessary to transform theory into reality, regardless of human cost. It was an agreement born of desperation and ambition, sealed by two men who understood they were embarking on a journey from which there could be no return, a journey that would ultimately lead one of them to the most gruesome death in recorded history. The wooden post in the marketplace was but a prelude to what would become one of history's most systematic destructions of an existing social order. With the people's trust reluctantly earned through that calculated display of reliability, Shang Yang began to unleash reforms so radical, so utterly transformative, that they would remake not just the political landscape of Qin, but the very soul of its people. What followed was not gentle reform, but revolutionary surgery performed without anesthetic on the body politic of an entire kingdom. His first target was the ancient well-field system, the communal land arrangement that had defined Chinese society for over a millennium. This wasn't merely an economic policy change, it was an assault on the fundamental assumptions about how civilized people organized themselves. For generations, families had worked the same plots, following the same seasonal rhythms, bound to the same nobles in relationships that stretched back through ancestral memory. Shang Yang's decree allowing private land ownership and free sale didn't just change property law, it shattered the cosmic order that had given meaning to countless lives. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Overnight, peasants who had known their place in the world suddenly found themselves thrust into a marketplace where their labor had monetary value and their loyalty could be bought and sold. The certainty of traditional relationships, however oppressive, gave way to the terrifying freedom of contractual arrangements. For the first time in their lives, common farmers could dream of owning the land they worked, but they also faced the nightmare possibility of losing everything to a bad harvest or a shrewder neighbor. But it was Shang Yang's military reforms that truly revealed the ruthless genius of his vision. He abolished the aristocratic monopoly on warfare and created instead a meritocracy of violence that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Under his new system, military rank and social status were determined not by bloodline but by battlefield performance, measured with grotesque precision by the number of enemy heads, a soldier could present as proof of his kills. This wasn't merely a change in military organization. It was the complete inversion of everything Chinese society had believed about honor, nobility, and the proper order of human relationships. The psychological transformation this created was profound and disturbing. Young men who had been destined for lives of agricultural labor suddenly saw paths to power and wealth that required nothing more than their willingness to kill and their skill at doing so efficiently. The heads of enemy soldiers became a currency more valuable than gold, and the battlefield became the ultimate marketplace where human lives were exchanged for social advancement. Peasant boys who had never dreamed of speaking to a nobleman found themselves elevated to positions of authority over the very aristocrats who had once ruled them, provided they could demonstrate sufficient proficiency in the art of decapitation. The old nobility watched this transformation with a horror that went beyond mere political opposition. They were witnessing the deliberate destruction of everything they understood about civilization itself. Their centuries of breeding, their careful cultivation of ritual knowledge, their inherited understanding of proper relationships between ruler and ruled, all of this was being declared worthless by a foreign intellectual who reduced human value to the simple arithmetic of severed heads and battlefield. Efficiency. The resistance began immediately, centered around the figure of Gong Ziqian, the crown prince's tutor, and a man who embodied everything the old order represented. His opposition to Shang Yang wasn't merely political, it was existential. He saw in the reformer's cold logic a threat not just to his own position, but to the fundamental concepts of virtue, propriety, and cosmic harmony that had sustained Chinese civilization for centuries. The court became a battleground between two incompatible visions of human nature: Shang Yang's mechanical universe of rewards and punishments, and the traditional world of moral cultivation and inherited wisdom. The collision between these worldviews reached its climax when the crown prince himself violated one of Xiangyang's new laws. The infraction was minor, perhaps a breach of protocol or a failure to observe some new regulation, but its political implications were enormous. Here was the ultimate test of whether Shang Yang's system would truly be impartial, whether the law would indeed be supreme over personal relationships and traditional hierarchies. Shang Yang's response was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty that demonstrated both his political genius and his profound indifference to human suffering. Unable to punish the prince directly without creating a constitutional crisis, he turned his attention to the men responsible for the prince's education. In a public ceremony that transformed justice into theater, he ordered Gong Ziqian's nose to be severed, and the other tutor, Gong Sunjia, to be branded with a criminal's tattoo across his face. The symbolism was unmistakable and devastating. The nose, in Chinese culture, was associated with dignity and social standing. Its removal was not just punishment, but deliberate humiliation designed to mark its victim as permanently degraded. The facial branding was equally significant, transforming a respected educator into a walking advertisement for the consequences of defying the new order. These weren't merely punishments, but acts of symbolic violence designed to demonstrate that no one, regardless of status or traditional claims to respect, was beyond the reach of Shang Yang's mechanical justice. The immediate effect was exactly what Shang Yang had calculated. The spectacle of two of the most respected men in the kingdom being publicly mutilated sent a shockwave through the entire social order. Nobles who had been plotting resistance suddenly found themselves confronting the reality that their traditional privileges meant nothing in the face of Shang Yang's impartial brutality. The whispered rebellions died in throats suddenly dry with fear, and the challenges to new regulations evaporated like morning mist before the sun of absolute enforcement. But while Shang Yang had won this particular battle, he had also created something far more dangerous than mere political opposition. He had transformed personal hatred into institutional memory, ensuring that his reforms would forever be associated in the minds of the powerful with arbitrary cruelty and foreign domination. The crown prince, forced to watch his teachers suffer for his own transgression, learned a lesson that Shang Yang had never intended to teach. That power exercised without regard for human dignity creates wounds that never heal and enemies who never forgive. The kingdom grew stronger, its armies more disciplined, its administration more efficient. But beneath this surface success, a poison was spreading through the very foundations of the system Shang Yang had built. His mechanical perfection had created not just order, but a hunger for vengeance that would prove more patient and ultimately more destructive than any external enemy. The reformer had won every battle against the old order, but in doing so, he had sown the seeds of a war that would ultimately consume him. The death of Duke Xiao was not a single moment, but a slow, agonizing dissolution that stretched across months, each labored breath echoing through the palace corridors like a countdown to catastrophe. The man who had gambled everything on Shang Yang's radical vision now lay wasting away in his royal chambers, his once powerful frame reduced to little more than skin stretched over brittle bones. But it wasn't just a ruler who was dying, it was the only barrier between Shang Yang and the seething hatred that had been building in the shadows for over 2 decades. With each rattling cough that escaped the Duke's lips, with each fevered night that brought him closer to the grave, the invisible threads that held Shang Yang's world together were snapping one by one. The palace had become a theater of barely concealed anticipation, where every courtier, every servant, every guard seemed to move with the careful deliberation of actors waiting for their cue. The old nobles, those scarred survivors of Shang Yang's reforms, gathered in hushed circles, their conversations dying to whispers whenever the reformer passed. They had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable, 20 years of watching their world be systematically dismantled by a foreign intellectual who showed them no more consideration than a farmer shows weeds. Now, as Duke Xiao's life ebbed away, they could taste revenge on the air like smoke from a distant fire. At the center of this web of hatred stood a figure whose very presence was a living reminder of Shang Yang's cruelty. Gongzi Qian, the prince's former tutor, his face permanently marked by the reformer's justice. Where his nose had once been, only a grotesque cavity remained, a wound that had never properly healed and never would. The disfigurement had transformed him from a respected educator into something else entirely, a walking monument to humiliation, a man whose every breath was a reminder of powerlessness transformed into purpose. For 20 years, he had lived with that mutilation, feeling phantom pain where his nose had been, seeing the barely concealed revulsion in people's eyes when they looked at him. But now, as he sensed the approaching end of Duke Xiao's protection, that constant ache had transformed into something far more dangerous: cold, patient, unforgiving purpose. The crown prince, now a man in his 30s but still carrying the psychological scars of that childhood trauma, moved through the palace like a coiled spring. King Huiwen, as he would soon be known, had spent decades watching his disfigured tutors, constant reminders of his own powerlessness in the face of Shang Yang's mechanical justice. The lesson he had learned was not the one Shang Yang intended: not respect for impartial law, but hatred for the man who had made him complicit in his teacher's suffering. Every time he looked at Gongzi Qian's ruined face, every time he saw the faded brands on Gongsun Jia's cheeks, he was transported back to that moment of helpless rage when he realized that even princes were nothing more than pieces in Shang Yang's grand game. Shang Yang himself seemed oblivious to the storm gathering around him, a blindness that was perhaps his greatest tragedy. The man who could see through the complexities of statecraft with crystalline clarity, who could engineer the transformation of an entire civilization, was incapable of recognizing the simple human truth that people do not forgive those who humiliate them. He had spent so many years viewing the world through the lens of his legalist philosophy, where human beings were nothing more than components in a vast machine, to be controlled through rewards and punishments that he had forgotten they were also creatures of memory, capable of nursing grudges across decades like tending sacred flames. His isolation was complete and self-imposed. The very efficiency of his reforms had eliminated the need for the personal relationships that might have protected him. He had no drinking companions, no hunting partners, no web of mutual obligations and shared secrets that characterized normal court life. His only relationship was with the law itself, that cold and impartial system he had crafted to replace the messy complications of human loyalty. He had made himself indispensable to the state, but he had also made himself friendless, and in the brutal mathematics of palace politics, indispensability without personal affection was nothing more than delayed vulnerability. When Duke Xiao finally drew his last breath on a cold morning in 338 BC, the silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of natural grief, but the charged stillness that precedes an avalanche. The succession was immediate and ceremonial. There would be no power struggle, no uncertainty about who would rule. King Huiwen ascended to the throne with all the legitimacy that birthright could provide. But those who knew how to read the subtle signs of court politics could see that something fundamental had shifted in the kingdom's gravitational field. The new king's first audiences were not with Shang Yang, as protocol might have suggested, but with a very different class of men, the survivors, the scarred, the dispossessed nobles who had been waiting decades for this moment. The conspiracy that began to form around the new king was not a sudden eruption of violence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare designed to isolate Shang Yang completely before destroying him. Led by the vengeful Gongzi Qian, whose mutilated face gave him a moral authority that resonated with everyone who had suffered under Shang Yang's reforms, the old guard began to weave a narrative that would justify what they had always wanted to do. They spoke not of personal revenge, but of state security, not of ancient grudges, but of present dangers. Shang Yang, they whispered to the new king, had grown too powerful, too independent, too comfortable with his authority. His private armies, his extensive network of loyal officials, his decades of accumulated power, all of this could be reframed, not as the tools of efficient governance, but as the infrastructure of potential rebellion. The beauty of their strategy lay in its basis in truth. Shang Yang did control vast resources, did command personal loyalty from many officials, did possess the administrative knowledge that made the kingdom function. These facts, which had once been sources of strength, were now being weaponized against him. The very competence that had made him invaluable was being recast as dangerous ambition, and the isolation that had protected him from personal entanglements now made him vulnerable to every accusation and suspicion. King Huiwen listened to these whispers with the satisfaction of a man finally hearing words he had longed to hear for decades. The careful, rational part of his mind understood that Shang Yang's administrative genius was the foundation of Qin's power, but the wounded child within him, the boy who had watched helplessly as his teachers were mutilated for his transgression, cared nothing for administrative efficiency. All he could see was an opportunity for the revenge that had been denied him for so long. The king who would inherit Shang Yang's system was also the man who would destroy its creator, and in that contradiction lay the seeds of one of history's most brutal ironies. The trap was being set with exquisite care, each element designed to use Shang Yang's own principles against him. The law he had crafted to be absolute and impartial would become the instrument of his destruction, wielded by men who understood that the greatest cruelty often wears the mask of justice. The reformer who had remade a kingdom was about to discover that his greatest creation could also become his most perfect executioner. The accusation of treason arrived like a thunderbolt on a clear day, shattering the illusion of security that Shang Yang had wrapped around himself like a protective shroud. It was not a sudden eruption of royal anger, but the culmination of months of careful preparation, a legal document so meticulously crafted that it bore all the hallmarks of Shang Yang's own administrative precision. The charges were breathtaking in their scope and devastating in their implications. Plotting rebellion against the crown, maintaining private armies, corrupting state officials, and preparing to usurp the throne itself. Each accusation was a masterpiece of political fiction, plausible enough to satisfy legal requirements while remaining fundamentally untrue. But truth had become irrelevant in the new mathematics of palace politics. King Huiwen, his face a mask of cold satisfaction as he reviewed the charges, cared nothing for evidence or proof. This was not about justice, it was about settling a debt that had accumulated interest for over 20 years. The king's hands trembled slightly as he signed the arrest warrant, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the barely contained excitement of a man finally able to strike back at the source of his deepest humiliation. The document that would destroy Shang Yang bore the same official seals and legal language that the reformer had used to destroy so many others, a perfect circle of bureaucratic vengeance. The warrant was issued in the pre-dawn hours, when the capital lay wrapped in darkness and most of its inhabitants slept peacefully in their beds. But Shang Yang was not sleeping. Perhaps some survival instinct, honed by decades of political maneuvering, had awakened him, or perhaps the weight of his isolation had finally penetrated even his legendary confidence. Whatever the reason, when the king's guards arrived at his residence with chains and shackles, they found only empty rooms and cold hearths. The architect of Qin's surveillance state had slipped through their fingers like smoke, vanishing into the night he had once ruled with such absolute authority. His flight was not the calculated retreat of a master strategist, but the desperate scramble of a hunted animal. For the first time in his adult life, Shang Yang found himself without power, without protection, without the vast administrative machinery that had made his will law throughout the kingdom. He rode through the darkness on a horse pushed to the edge of collapse, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend how completely his world had disintegrated in a single night. The man who had once commanded armies and reshaped civilizations was now reduced to the most basic human struggle, the simple desire to survive until dawn. The roads he traveled were ones he had built. The watchtowers that might spot him were ones he had ordered constructed. The guards who hunted him were men trained according to his regulations. Every element of the infrastructure he had created to strengthen Qin had become part of the trap closing around him. The irony was so complete it bordered on the cosmic. He was being pursued by his own legacy, hunted by the very system he had perfected. The kingdom had become a vast machine designed to catch fleeing criminals, and now its most famous architect had become its prey. Exhausted and desperate, Shang Yang sought refuge at a small inn near the border, a humble establishment that seemed to offer anonymity and shelter. But when he approached the innkeeper and requested a room for the night, he encountered the most devastating moment of his entire ordeal. The innkeeper, a simple man who had probably never been more than a few miles from his birthplace, looked at the haggard traveler with bureaucratic suspicion and demanded to see his travel documents, his huji, the identification papers that Shang Yang's own laws required every citizen to carry. The request hit him like a physical blow. Here was his life's work reduced to its most basic, most personal application. The system of population control and movement restriction he had designed to prevent vagrancy and maintain order was now being used to deny him the most fundamental human courtesy. The innkeeper's voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of malice or recognition. Lord Shang's law prohibits me from housing anyone without proper identification. I could be executed for harboring an undocumented traveler. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, each syllable a reminder of the inexorable logic he had built into the legal system. Standing in that humble inn, rejected by his own law, Shang Yang experienced what may have been the most profound moment of clarity in his entire life. He saw himself as his victims must have seen him, not as a brilliant reformer bringing order to chaos, but as a man so obsessed with systematic control that he had forgotten the human cost of his perfection. The innkeeper's refusal was not personal. It was the impersonal cruelty of the machine he had built, operating exactly as designed. He had created a system so efficient, so thoroughly enforced, that it could not make exceptions even for its own creator. Rejected by his homeland and barred from shelter by his own laws, Shang Yang turned toward Wei, the state of his birth, hoping that some vestige of old loyalty or sympathy might offer him sanctuary. It was a desperate gamble, the hope of a drowning man grasping for any floating debris. But as he approached the border, he found his path blocked by Wei soldiers who recognized him immediately. Their commander, a veteran who bore scars from battles against Qin, smiled with cold satisfaction as he delivered his verdict. "You are a man without honor, a betrayer who used false peace talks to capture our general. The state of Wei will not shelter a traitor, nor will we allow you passage through our territory to escape justice." The rejection was complete and final. Behind him lay Qin, where he was now a wanted criminal. Before him lay Wei, which would not forget his past treacheries. Around him stretched a world that had no place for a man who had made himself essential to one kingdom while making himself hated by all others. He had become a living paradox too valuable to ignore, too dangerous to shelter, too proud to surrender, too intelligent not to understand the hopelessness of his situation. With nowhere left to run and no allies remaining, Shang Yang made the only choice available to a man who had spent his life believing in the power of will over circumstance. He would return to his old fief of Shang, gather what remained of his loyal followers, and make his final stand against the kingdom he had helped create. It was not a rational decision. His small force could never hope to defeat the Qin army, but it was the last gesture of defiance available to a man who had never learned to surrender. The battle, when it came, was less a military engagement than an execution dressed in the pageantry of war. Shang Yang's handful of supporters, loyal to the end but hopelessly outnumbered, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. The reformer himself wielded a sword with surprising skill, but individual prowess meant nothing against the disciplined efficiency of the army he had helped train. The outcome was never in doubt. Only the duration of the slaughter remained to be determined. When the dust settled and the last echoes of clashing steel faded across the battlefield, Shang Yang found himself wounded, captured, and bound like a common criminal. The man who had once sat at the right hand of power was now a prisoner of war, his fate to be determined by the very legal system he had created. The irony was perfect and terrible. He would be judged by his own laws, condemned by his own principles, and executed according to his own methods. The machine he had built would now consume its creator with the same mechanical efficiency it had shown toward all his other victims. The trial of Shang Yang was not a legal proceeding, but a ritual of vengeance disguised in the robes of justice, a carefully choreographed performance designed to provide the thin veneer of legitimacy to what was, in essence, a public lynching. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had come not to witness justice, but to savor the destruction of the man who had terrorized their world for over 2 decades. Among them sat the scarred and branded survivors of his reforms, their mutilated faces testimony to the cruelty they now sought to repay with interest. The verdict had been decided before the first witness spoke, before the first piece of evidence was presented, before Shang Yang was even dragged into the chamber in chains that bore the royal seal. King Huiwen presided over these proceedings with the cold satisfaction of a man finally able to inflict pain on the source of his deepest trauma. His eyes never left Shang Yang's face as the charges were read, searching for some sign of fear, some crack in the reformer's legendary composure that would provide the psychological satisfaction he had craved for decades. But even now, bound and defeated, Shang Yang maintained the same analytical detachment that had characterized his entire career, his mind still trying to understand the mechanics of his own destruction, even as the machinery of death ground inexorably toward its conclusion. The sentence, when it came, was delivered with theatrical gravity: death by 5-chariot dismemberment, a method of execution so barbaric that it was reserved only for the most heinous crimes against the state. This was not merely capital punishment, but systematic obliteration, the complete destruction of the human form as a symbol of the complete destruction of the man himself. The method was chosen not for its efficiency. Simple beheading would have sufficed to end a life, but for its capacity to create a spectacle so horrifying that it would be remembered for generations as the ultimate consequence of challenging royal authority. The execution ground had been transformed into an amphitheater of horror, with viewing platforms erected for the nobility and special areas reserved for foreign dignitaries who had come to witness this demonstration of Qin's justice. Vendors moved through the crowd selling food and drink, turning the systematic destruction of a human being into a festival atmosphere that revealed something profoundly disturbing about the capacity for civilized people to celebrate cruelty when it was given official sanction. The very efficiency of the arrangements, the careful placement of the chariots, the selection of the strongest horses, the precise calculation of angles and forces bore the hallmarks of Shang Yang's own administrative methods, as if the state were using his techniques to destroy him. As Shang Yang was dragged to the center of the execution ground, his body already weakened by imprisonment and torture, the crowd's roar reached a crescendo of bloodthirsty anticipation. Here was the man who had remade their world through fear and systematic brutality, now reduced to nothing more than a piece of meat to be torn apart for their entertainment. The irony was lost on most of the spectators, but perhaps Shang Yang himself understood it in those final moments. He had created a system so efficient at dehumanizing its victims that it could now dehumanize him with perfect bureaucratic precision. The binding of his limbs to the 5 chariots was conducted with the same methodical care that characterized all of Qin's administrative procedures. Each rope was checked for strength, each knot tested for security, each horse examined for fitness. The executioners were professionals who had performed this ritual before, men who understood that the effectiveness of the spectacle depended not just on the victim's death, but on the duration and visibility of his suffering. They worked with the calm efficiency of craftsmen, their faces showing no more emotion than a blacksmith shaping iron or a carpenter joining wood. When the signal was given, and the horses were driven in 5 different directions, the sound that rose from Shang Yang's throat was unlike anything humana cry that seemed to emerge from the depths of agony itself, a sound that would haunt the dreams of witnesses for years to come. His body, that vessel which had housed one of history's most brilliant legal minds, was torn apart with the same mechanical precision he had applied to tearing apart the old social order. Limbs separated from torso with wet, tearing sounds that mixed with the cheers of the crowd and the thundering of hooves on packed earth. But the physical dismemberment was only the beginning of Shang Yang's obliteration. In a final act of bureaucratic thoroughness that he himself might have admired, King Huiwen ordered the execution of Shang Yang's entire family wife, children, parents, siblings, anyone who shared his blood or bore his name. This was not merely revenge, but the systematic erasure of a bloodline, ensuring that no one would remain to carry his memory or seek vengeance for his death. The reformer who had believed that individuals were nothing more than components in a vast state machine was now discovering that the machine could eliminate entire families with the same cold efficiency it applied to everything else. Yet even as Shang Yang's blood soaked into the earth and his family's screams echoed through the capital's streets, the most profound irony of his life was beginning to unfold. King Huiwen, having satisfied his hunger for personal vengeance, now faced the practical reality of governing a kingdom whose strength depended entirely on the system his victim had created. The military meritocracy that had made Qin's armies invincible, the legal code that had brought order to chaos, the administrative structure that had transformed a backward kingdom into a regional power, all of this remained in place, functioning with the same mechanical precision that had characterized Shang Yang's living administration. The king who had ordered the reformers' dismemberment was also wise enough to preserve his reforms, creating a situation that would have appealed to Shang Yang's sense of irony if he had lived to witness it. The man was destroyed, but the system endured, proving that ideas could be more durable than the flesh that conceived them. King Weiwen kept every one of Shang Yang's laws, promoted every one of his administrative innovations, and continued every one of his military policies. The reformer's blood had been spilled to satisfy personal hatred, but his intellectual legacy was preserved to serve state interests. In the decades that followed, Qin's power continued to grow exponentially, fed by the same ruthless efficiency that Shang Yang had built into its foundations. His system of centralized authority and merit-based advancement created a state machine that could mobilize resources and manpower on a scale never before seen in Chinese history. The kingdom that had once been dismissed as a barbaric backwater became the dominant military force of its age, conquering rival states with a methodical precision that bore the unmistakable signature of its dead architect's mind. The ultimate vindication of Shang Yang's vision came in 221 BC, when his adopted kingdom finally achieved what no state had accomplished in over 5 centuries: the complete unification of China under a single ruler. The first emperor of Qin, ruling through institutions and methods that Shang Yang had designed, created the first truly unified Chinese empire, establishing precedents for centralized government that would endure for over 2 millennia. The reformer who had been torn apart by horses had, through his ideas, achieved a form of immortality that no monument could provide. But this triumph came with a terrible cost that Shang Yang himself might have predicted if he had understood human nature as well as he understood administrative efficiency. The same system that unified China also exhausted it, demanding a level of control and surveillance that eventually broke the spirit of the people it governed. The Qin dynasty, built on the bones of its first great reformer, collapsed within 15 years of achieving its greatest victory, consumed by the same harsh logic that had made it invincible. The legacy of Shang Yang's dismemberment extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of his death. His story became a cautionary tale about the price of radical reform and the danger of treating human beings as nothing more than components in a political machine. Later, Chinese philosophers would point to his fate as evidence that even the most brilliant mind cannot escape the consequences of its own moral blindness, that systems built without regard for human dignity will ultimately consume their creators. Yet his influence on Chinese civilization proved more enduring than any of his critics could have imagined. The concept of rule by law rather than rule by personal relationships, the idea that merit should determine social position, the notion that the state's needs supersede individual desires, all of these revolutionary concepts, born in the mind of a man who died screaming as horses tore his body apart, became fundamental principles of Chinese governance that would shape the destiny of a civilization for thousands of years. The blood-soaked execution ground where Shang Yang met his end has long since been paved over and forgotten, but the ideas that died with him on that terrible day continue to echo through history. His dismemberment was complete and horrifying, but his intellectual DNA survived to replicate itself in every dynasty that followed, a ghostly presence that haunts Chinese politics to this day. The man who believed that ideas were more powerful than individuals proved his point in the most brutal way possible by demonstrating that even when the flesh is destroyed, the mind's creations can achieve a form of immortality that transcends death itself. In the end, Shang Yang's story serves as a stark reminder that the sword of radical change, while capable of carving out new worlds, rarely spares the hand that wields it. His genius lay in understanding how to transform societies, but his tragedy was in failing to understand that the people whose lives he transformed would never forgive him for the transformation. He built a perfect machine for governing human beings, but forgot that human beings, unlike machines, remember their pain and seek revenge for their suffering. The reformer who dismantled the old world was ultimately dismantled by the new one he created, his body torn apart by the same systematic cruelty he had made the foundation of his state.